sense her determination. He was proud of her, proud of how she'd stuck up for Nina, proud that she hadn't been broken. He also felt more protective toward this woman than anyone else he'd rescued. He couldn't identify all the reasons why, but the feeling was definitely there. Arrow could have probably resisted the emotions he could feel bubbling under the surface if she weren't unconsciously leaning into him every chance she got. She might be tough and composed on the surface, but that slight telltale movement offered a very different story. Underneath her bravado, she was scared to death. Arrow wanted to take her in his arms and reassure her. Tell her that he'd get her home to her father, to safety. But he knew from experience that showing even the slightest amount of sympathy right now could undo her. So he restricted himself to small touches, making sure he stayed by her side, giving her what comfort he could while still being on alert for the smallest signs of danger. After what she'd been through, whatever that was, he wasn't going to let anyone or anything hurt her again before he got her home. "All clear," Black said in a toneless whisper as he reappeared next to them without another sound. The man had been a Navy SEAL and could move silently through any kind of terrain. Arrow had long since gotten used to it, but next to him he felt Morgan start violently as Black's presence surprised her. But she didn't make a sound. She'd trained herself well to keep quiet. He'd noticed that in the room where she and Nina had been held captive. When he'd hit her arms to knock the knife out of her hand, she hadn't cried out. When the little girl had thrown herself at her, Morgan hadn't let out even the smallest oomph as she'd landed on her ass. It had surprised him at the same time it impressed the hell out of him. He and his teammates had learned to move absolutely silently, but it had taken him years of training in the Marines and more dangerous missions than he could count. The mystery of how and why Morgan had learned to be silent, no matter what, bothered him.
"We need to move quickly," Black went on. "The safe house is roughly half a mile away, but we're about 30 minutes later than we'd planned. The city is waking up, and the last thing we want is for someone to see us and get curious."
Arrow pressed his lips together. 3 Caucasian men wandering around the city wearing all black, with a woman and child in tow, would definitely attract attention, the kind they didn't need. He opened his mouth to speak, but Morgan beat him to it. "We should split up," she said quietly. "We're slowing you guys down. If we split up, you can move faster with Nina," she told Ball, nodding at the child now sleeping in his arms. Arrow could see how much the suggestion cost her. She was gripping Nina's shirt in her fist so hard her knuckles were white. Black looked toward Arrow with one brow raised. From the second they'd stepped outside the hovel where they'd rescued the pair, Arrow's teammates had realized he had a connection with Morgan. It worked like that sometimes on their missions. They were trained to watch the reactions of the women and children, and if they showed the slightest inclination to trust one of the men over another, the team did what they could to encourage that. Trust was a huge issue when rescuing kidnapping victims, and having a victim trust even one of them made the mission that much easier. They'd read Morgan's body language as easily as he had, not to mention the way he'd been hovering over her. Black was asking, without words, for Arrow's opinion on splitting up. There was no doubt that he'd be the one going with Morgan. Arrow turned to the woman at his side. He towered over her slight 5 feet 3 inches. At an inch over 6 feet, he was used to being taller than the people they rescued, but her diminutive height was one of the things that made his protective instincts rush to the surface more than usual. He slowly moved his hand and lightly brushed his fingertips against her upper arm. It was covered in a ratty gray t-shirt, but he could feel the heat of her skin through it.
"Are you sure?"
he asked.
"It would make things easier, but if you don't want to be separated from Nina, we can make it work."
She tilted her chin up to look him in the eyes, which Arrow loved. She was scared and nervous, but hadn't been beaten down to a point where she refused to meet his gaze. "I want to do whatever will get Nina safe the fastest."